I still remember the exact moment I decided I would never tell my family the truth. I was 16 years old, sitting in the back pew of Cornerstone Baptist Church in Nashville, Tennessee, watching my older brother Marcus get baptized. The whole congregation was on their feet. My mother was crying the way she only cried in church, quietly, with her hand pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to hold her heart in place. My father had his arm around her shoulders, and he was smiling the way I almost never saw him smile. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that I would do absolutely anything to protect that picture. Whatever I was, whatever was growing quietly and undeniably inside me, I would keep it so far underground that it would never see light. I would carry it alone for the rest of my life if I had to. I carried it for 18 years. My name is Daniel Merritt, and I was born the second son of Gerald and Connie Merritt of Nashville, Tennessee. My father drove a delivery truck for 31 years, and my mother taught third grade at the same elementary school she'd attended as a child. We were not wealthy, but we were steady. We had a house on Plover Street with a big oak tree in the front yard, and every Sunday we were in church by 9:15, and every Sunday night my mother made pot roast, and every Friday my father watched whatever game was on with a beer he tried to hide from my mother, even though she always knew. It was a life built on routine and love, and a particular kind of quiet faith that didn't need to announce itself because it was simply everywhere, woven into every corner of who we were. Marcus was 3 years older than me, and he was, I don't say this with resentment, I say it because it's simply true, everything our parents had hoped a son would be. He was tall and easy with people, the kind of person who remembered everyone's name and meant it when he asked how you were doing. He played baseball through high school, dated a girl named Priscilla from our church youth group for most of his 20s, and eventually married her in a ceremony so beautiful it made the older women in our congregation cry for days afterward. He was not perfect, he had a temper when he was young, and he said things sometimes without thinking, but he loved our parents with the same bone-deep devotion they'd raised us both to carry, and they loved him back with a fierceness that was visible from across a room. And then there was me. I was quieter than Marcus, slower to speak and faster to feel. I loved music, I'd been singing in the church choir since I was 8 years old, and I loved reading, and I spent a lot of time in my own head in ways that my father found difficult to understand but never said so directly. I was a good student, I was kind, I never gave my parents any real trouble. And I was gay in a way that felt less like a choice or a phase or a confusion, and more like a fundamental, unchangeable fact of my own nature, the way some people are left-handed or colorblind. It was just there. It had always been there. And from the time I was old enough to understand what it meant in the context of Cornerstone Baptist Church and Plover Street and everything my family believed, I understood that it was the one true thing about me that I could never, under any circumstances, speak out loud. So I built a life around the silence. In high school I dated a girl named Amy for 7 months because she asked me, and because I genuinely liked her, and because saying yes felt like throwing a coat over something I didn't want anyone to see. In college at Belmont University, I had a single relationship with a man named Christopher that lasted 4 months and ended when I told him I couldn't do it, that I wasn't ready, that I was sorry. I didn't even fully explain why. I just left, and I carried the shame of that with me for years. I threw myself into music, into the studio work I was starting to pick up around Nashville, into building a career as a session musician and eventually a vocal coach, into every available corner of my life that wasn't the one corner I refused to look at directly. By the time I was 32, I had a nice apartment in East Nashville, a group of friends who knew the truth about me and held it carefully, a career I was genuinely proud of, and a family I visited for Sunday dinners who had no idea who I actually was. I had become an expert at living in 2 worlds simultaneously, and most of the time I was able to convince myself that this was sustainable, that it was even okay. That some people simply have private selves and public selves, and the gap between them doesn't have to be grief. Then Marcus called me to say he was finally proposing to Priscilla. They'd been together for 8 years by then. Priscilla was a dental hygienist with a laugh that arrived before she did, and a warmth so consistent it almost felt structural, like something holding the room up. I loved her. I had loved her for years, the way you love someone who makes the person you love most in the world visibly, undeniably happier. When Marcus told me he was going to ask her, I could hear in his voice something I'd never quite heard there before, a softness, a vulnerability, the sound of a man who was genuinely terrified of how much he wanted something. I told him she was going to say yes. He laughed and said he knew, but that knowing it and asking it were 2 completely different experiences, and I said yes, I imagine they are, and there was something in that exchange that sat with me longer than I expected. He asked her at a restaurant on a Tuesday night in March, and she said yes before he'd finished the sentence, and when he called to tell me I could hear her laughing in the background, and I sat down on my kitchen floor and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years. I told myself it was joy. It was partly joy. The wedding was set for the following October. Marcus asked me to be his best man, and I said yes without hesitation because there was no universe in which I would have said anything else. What I didn't anticipate, what I should have anticipated, was the best man speech. I've been a vocalist for most of my adult life. I'm not afraid of a microphone. I've sung in front of thousands of people. I've coached professional performers through stage fright. I understand the mechanics of performance and presence in a way that is by now almost entirely unconscious. But the speech was something different. The speech was not performance. The speech was supposed to be truth, in front of every person who mattered to my family, in a room that included my parents and their friends from church and Marcus's childhood teammates and relatives I hadn't seen in years. And the truth of who I was had been locked in a room inside me for so long that I wasn't sure I even knew anymore how to open the door. I started writing it in July. I wrote 11 different versions. Every single one felt hollow, not because I didn't love Marcus. I loved him more than I knew how to say, but because everything I wrote felt like it was coming from a version of me that didn't fully exist. I wrote about growing up together, about the time he covered for me when I broke my mother's favorite lamp, about the way he'd always shown up when I needed him, and all of it was true, every word, but underneath it was this other truth, this immovable, patient thing that I kept writing around. And eventually, the writing around it started to feel like a kind of dishonesty. I wasn't sure I could stand up in front of 200 people and perform. In September, 6 weeks before the wedding, I met someone. His name was Theo, and I met him at a studio session. He was a songwriter who'd come in to do some scratch vocals on a demo he was pitching to a label in New York. He was originally from Knoxville, and he'd been out since he was 19, and he had the particular quality of a person who has already done the hardest thing they'll ever do and arrived on the other side of it with something like peace. We got coffee after the session and talked for 3 hours. We went to dinner the following week. Within a month we were together, cautiously and honestly, and with a kind of care I hadn't let myself extend to another person in years. I didn't tell my family. I told myself I would tell them eventually. After the wedding I said, "Things are complicated right now," I said. "I don't want to distract from Marcus and Priscilla's moment," I said. Theo heard all of this with patience and kindness, but about 3 weeks before the wedding he said something to me that I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "Daniel, I'm not asking you to make an announcement. I'm asking you to stop hiding like you've done something wrong." He said it quietly, without accusation, and then he said he was going to get more coffee, and he went to the kitchen, and I sat there on his couch and felt the truth of it move through me like a current. The night before the wedding, the rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant in Green Hills that Priscilla's family had reserved for the evening. It was a beautiful room, warm and full of candlelight, and the sound of people who were genuinely happy to be together. I sat between my mother and Marcus's college roommate, and I drank one glass of wine and then another, and I watched my brother across the table with his arm around Priscilla, laughing at something her father had said, and I thought about the speech I was going to give the next day. I had finally written a version I thought I could deliver. It was good. It was warm and funny, and it would make people cry at the right moments, and it said nothing about me at all. It was the 12th version, and it was the most hollow of all of them, and standing in the parking lot of that restaurant at 10:30 at night, breathing October air and looking at the Nashville skyline, I knew I wasn't going to give it. I called Theo. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I think I'm going to say something tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Are you sure?" I said I wasn't sure of anything, but that I was tired, and that I loved my brother, and that I wanted to give a toast at his wedding that was actually true. I said I didn't know exactly what I was going to say or how I was going to say it. Theo said, "You've been singing in front of people your whole life. You know how to find the words when you're standing there. Trust that." I didn't sleep much that night. The wedding was at 4 o'clock at Cornerstone Baptist Church, the same church where I'd watched Marcus get baptized at 16 years old, the same church where I'd made my decision to stay silent, the same pews and the same light coming through the same stained glass windows. Priscilla walked down the aisle in a dress that made Marcus press his lips together hard in the way he always did when he was trying not to show emotion, and the ceremony was exactly what a ceremony at Cornerstone Baptist Church is supposed to be: solemn and joyful and thick with scripture and meaning. My mother cried. My father put his arm around her. I stood at the front next to Marcus and held the rings and watched all of it, and I felt the full weight of what I was about to do settle over me. The reception was at a venue about 20 minutes away, a restored barn on the edge of the city that Priscilla had found online and fallen in love with. By the time the speeches were scheduled, just after dinner, the room was warm and slightly golden with twinkle lights, and the sound of people who had eaten well and drunk enough to be generous with their happiness. The maid of honor went first. She was Priscilla's cousin, and she gave a speech that was funny and sweet and made everyone laugh twice and cry once, and the applause for her was genuine and full. Then someone handed me the microphone. I stood up, I looked out at the room, 200 faces, every single one familiar in some way, some of them people I'd known for 30 years, all of them looking at me with the open, relaxed warmth of people at a wedding who are expecting something uncomplicated. I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with his arm around Priscilla and a small, private smile, the smile he reserved for just me, the one that meant he knew I was about to do something worth listening to. I said, Marcus, you've been my brother for 34 years, and in that time I have given a lot of thought to what I wanted to say to you at this moment. I wrote about 12 different versions of this speech, actually. A small laugh moved through the room, and every single one of them was true, and every single one of them felt incomplete. Because there's something I've been trying to find the right time to say for a long time, and I think the right time is probably now, in front of everyone who loves you, because you deserve to know your brother for real. The room was quiet, not uncomfortable, just listening, the way a room listens when it senses something real is coming. I'm gay, I said. I have been my whole life, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades keeping that from this family because I was afraid of what it would cost me. I was afraid of losing this, all of you, this table, this church, the life we built together on Plover Street. My voice held. I'd spent enough years using it professionally that it held even when the rest of me was close to breaking. And I'm telling you today, at your wedding, not to make it about me. I promise the rest of this is about you and Priscilla, but because watching you love someone the way you love her, without apology, without hiding, made me want to be that honest at least once in my life. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt longer. Marcus stood up. He didn't say anything. He walked around the table and he put his arms around me and he held on, and I heard him say, very quietly, next to my ear, I love you, Danny. I love you exactly like this. And that was when I lost it, completely in front of 200 people at my brother's wedding. I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since I was a child, the kind of crying that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with something long compressed finally releasing, the sound of a door finally opening. The room gave us a moment, and then slowly there was applause, and I heard my mother's voice somewhere in it, not words, just a sound, a kind of confirmation. And when Marcus let go of me, I looked at her and she was standing too, and my father beside her, and his face was not the face of a man who had just learned something devastating. It was the face of a man who was looking at his son. I finished the toast. I talked about Marcus and Priscilla for another 5 minutes. I talked about what it meant to watch him love someone with that particular quality of commitment, that particular refusal to be anything other than fully present, and I said that he taught me more than he knew about what real love actually looks like. I said that I wished them everything they deserved, which was more happiness than either of them could currently imagine. I raised my glass. The room raised theirs. After the speeches, after the first dance, after the cake, my mother found me near the back of the room where I'd stepped out to get some air and get myself together. She was small and she was 61, and she'd been crying on and off since the ceremony, and when she reached me, she took both of my hands in both of hers, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "How long?" I said, "A long time, Mama." She nodded, she squeezed my hands. She said, "You should have told me sooner." I said I was afraid. She said, "I know, but Daniel, you are my child. There is nothing, do you understand me? There is nothing you could be that would change what you are to me." She paused. "I don't know everything yet. I don't know what to say about all of it, but I need you to understand that you are my son and I love you, and that is not a complicated sentence." My father came and found us a few minutes later. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when he was working something out. He's not a man who says a lot. He never has been. He looked at me and he said, "You doing okay?" I said I thought so. He nodded. He put one hand briefly on my shoulder, firm and deliberate, and then he said, "Good," and he went back inside, and that was my father telling me what he needed me to know. It wasn't all easy after that. There were conversations, long ones, uncomfortable ones, conversations that required more honesty and patience than any of us were naturally accustomed to. There were people from the church who heard about it and didn't handle it the way my parents did. There were relatives who went quiet, and one who said something at Christmas that my mother shut down so fast and so completely that it was never said again. There were moments of genuine confusion and moments of genuine grace, and the line between them wasn't always where I expected it. But Marcus called me the morning after his wedding, from his hotel room before he and Priscilla left for their honeymoon, and he said, "That was the best wedding speech I've ever heard." I laughed. He said, "I mean it, I'm serious. It was the truest thing anyone has ever said at one of these things." And then he said, "I want to meet him. When we get back, Theo, I want to have dinner." I brought Theo to Sunday dinner in December. My mother made pot roast. My father watched the game with him in the living room for an hour before dinner, and they talked about Theo's family in Knoxville and his father's years working for TVA. And by the time we sat down, my father was calling him by his first name and refilling his glass without being asked, which was, if you knew my father, something very close to a formal declaration of welcome. I still sing at Cornerstone Baptist Church sometimes, when they have me. It's complicated. Any place where you spent years hiding something important is complicated, and the institution itself is still working through questions I don't expect it to resolve quickly. But the choir director, an older woman named Miss Evelyn who has been directing the music at that church since before I was born, came up to me after the first Sunday I came back, and she took my face in her hands the way older women from the South are permitted to do, and she said, "Baby, your voice sounds different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "It sounds like it's coming from somewhere real." I thought about that for a long time. I think she was right. I think when you spend years routing everything through a persona, a performance of yourself that is carefully curated to show only what is safe, even the beautiful things, even the singing, even the love, even the loyalty, get filtered through something that muffles them just slightly. A cost you don't fully notice until it's gone. Theo and I have been together for almost 2 years now. We got an apartment together in East Nashville last spring, a place with a small back porch that looks out over a garden we're pretending we're going to maintain. Marcus and Priscilla come for dinner at least once a month. My mother calls more than she used to, which I think is her way of closing a gap she feels bad about, even though she couldn't have closed it herself. My father asks about Theo by name, every time, and remembers the details of things Theo has told him in a way that tells me he is paying attention. I don't know that I'd recommend 18 years of silence to anyone. I don't know that I could have done it differently with what I understood at 16, but I know the cost of it now in a way I didn't fully understand while I was paying it. I know what it takes out of you to curate yourself that completely, to give everyone around you a version of your love that is real but partial, to stand in rooms full of people who love you and feel fundamentally alone. What I know equally, though, and this matters, is that the coming apart of it did not destroy anything I was afraid of losing. My brother did not love me less. My mother did not turn away. My father, in his particular, economical way, let me know I was still his son. The church is complicated, and some of the people in it are complicated, and there are parts of that community I grieve, but the core of what I was trying to protect, the family on Plover Street, the pot roast, the hand on my shoulder, the small private smile across the table, that survived, that more than survived. I was standing at my brother's wedding when I finally told the truth, and the truth did not break anything. It opened something. It let light into a room that had been dark for 18 years, and what was in that room turned out not to be shameful or broken or wrong. What was in that room was just me. And I was worth knowing,